My name is Robert Sakula. I'm an architect and urbanist, and I'm a partner of Ash Sakula Architects. And we're based in Bloomsbury in London, and I'm speaking from our office here now. I'm reading tonight's bedtime story as part of the Architecture Foundation 100-Day Studio, and many thanks to Alicia, who invited me, and to Rosie, who showed me how the technology worked. And I hope it is working. My story tonight has got absolutely nothing to do with architecture or cities or urbanism. In fact, it's probably about as far away from them as it could possibly be. It's an extract from The Winter Journey by Apsley Cherry-Garrard. Now, Cherry-Garrard was the chronicler of Captain Scott's doomed expedition to the South Pole in 1911. He was the youngest member of Scott's Antarctic voyage. But before that journey, however, he and two of the party who later all died on their return with Scott from the South Pole made a journey many weeks long in the middle of the Antarctic winter. That would be the Antarctic winter of 1911, kind of, because the Antarctic winter is sort of May to July, August in 1911. And they made this journey to retrieve eggs from a colony of emperor penguins. They believed that studying the embryology of these penguins would throw light on their evolutionary forebears, the dinosaurs. Now, the three men almost died many times over in the course of their journey, and the piece I'm going to read is from the early stages of the journey. It's a story about extreme cold and constant darkness. So this is not a cosy bedtime story, but it may make you feel all the cozier by contrast. The horrors of what he experienced in the Antarctic and the loss of his friends led Cherry-Garrard to depression and breakdown when he returned to Britain in 1913. He was haunted by the possibility that he could have been able to save Scott and his companions. And he didn't write his account of the expedition until years later, when he was invalided home from the First World War. And it probably would not have been completed without the encouragement and praise of his friend and neighbour, George Bernard Shaw. Cherry-Garrard represented, his biographer Sarah Wheeler wrote, quote, a certain kind of Englishness, quizzical detachment, a finely tuned sense of irony, an infinite capacity for gloom, tempered with elegiac melancholy, born in an age as remote as the South Pole. So The Winter Journey is one of the chapters in the book which Cherry-Garrard finally published in 1922. The book as a whole is called The Worst Journey in the World, and it seems clear, see if you agree after my reading, that this refers to his winter journey rather than to Scott's later, ill-fated and much better known polar journey, from which none of the participants survived. It's probably my favourite travel book, and I think if I hadn't been an architect, I'd have wanted to be an explorer. So I shall read it. A hard night, clear, with a blue sky so deep that it looks black. The stars are steel points, the glaciers burnished silver. The snow rings and thuds to your footfall. The ice is cracking to the falling temperature, and the tide crack groans as the water rises, and over all, wave above wave, fold upon fold, there hangs the curtain of the aurora. As you watch, it fades away, and then quite suddenly a great beam flashes up and rushes to the zenith, an arch of palest green and orange, a tail of flaming gold, and again it falls, fading away into great searchlight beams which rise behind the smoking crater of Mount Erebus. Three men, one of whom at any rate is feeling a little frightened, stand panting and sweating out in McMurdo Sound. They have two sledges, one tied behind the other, and these sledges are piled high with sleeping bags and camping equipment, 6 weeks' provisions, and a venesta case full of scientific gear for pickling and preserving. In addition, there is a pickaxe, ice axes, an alpine rope, a large piece of green Willesden canvas, and a bit of board. Our weights for such travelling are enormous, 253 pounds a man. It's midday, but it is pitchy dark, and it is not warm. What is this venture? Why is the embryo of the emperor penguin so important to science, and why should 3 sane and common-sense explorers be sledging away on a winter's night to a cape which has only been visited before in daylight, and then with great difficulty? I have explained more fully in the introduction to this book the knowledge that the world possessed at this time of the emperor penguin, but it is because the emperor is probably the most primitive bird in existence that the working out of his embryology is so important. The embryo shows remains of the development of an animal in former ages and former states. It recapitulates its former lives. The embryo of an emperor may prove the missing link between birds and the reptiles from which the birds have sprung. Only one rookery of emperor penguins has been found at this date, and this was on the sea ice inside a little bay of the barrier edge at Cape Crozier, which was guarded by miles of some of the biggest pressure in the Antarctic. Chicks had been found in September, and Wilson reckoned that the eggs must have been laid in the beginning of July. And so we started just after midwinter on the weirdest bird's nesting expedition that has ever been or ever will be. The horror of the 19 days it took us to travel from Cape Evans to Cape Crozier would have to be re-experienced to be appreciated, and anyone would be a fool who went again. It is not possible to describe it. The weeks which followed them were comparative bliss, not because later our conditions were better, they were far worse, but because we were callous. I, for one, had come to that point of suffering at which I did not really care if only I could die without much pain. It was the darkness that did it. I don't believe -70 temperatures would be bad in daylight, not comparatively bad, when you could see where you were going, where you were stepping, where the sledge straps were, the cooker, the primus, the food, could see your footsteps lately trodden deep into the soft snow that you might find your way back to the rest of your load, could see the lashings of the food bags, could read a compass without striking 3 or 4 different boxes to find one dry match, could read your watch to see if the blissful moment of getting out of your bag was come without groping in the snow all around, when it would not take you 5 minutes to lash up the door of the tent and 5 hours to get started in the morning. But in those days, we were never less than 4 hours from the moment when Bill cried, "Time to get up," to the time when we got into our harness. It took 2 men to get 1 man into his harness, and was all they could do, for the canvas was frozen and our clothes were frozen, until sometimes not even 2 men could bend them into the required shape. The trouble is sweat and breath. I never knew before how much of the body's waste comes out through the pores of the skin. On the most bitter days, when we had to camp before we had done a 4-hour march in order to nurse back our frozen feet, it seemed that we must be sweating, and all this sweat, instead of passing away through the porous wool of our clothing and gradually drying off us, froze and accumulated. It passed just away from our flesh and then became ice. We shook plenty of snow and ice down from inside our trousers every time we changed our footgear, and we could have shaken it from our vests and from between our vests and shirts, but of course we could not strip to that extent. But when we got into our sleeping bags, if we were fortunate, we became warm enough during the night to thaw this ice. Part remained in our clothes, part passed into the skins of our sleeping bags, and soon both were sheets of armour plate. As for our breath, In the daytime it did nothing worse than cover the lower parts of our faces with ice and solder our balaclavas tightly to our heads. It was no good trying to get your balaclava off until you had the primus going quite for a long time. And then you could throw your breath around if you wished. The trouble really began in your sleeping bag, for it was far too cold to keep a hole open through which to breathe. So all night long our breath froze into the skins, and our respiration became quicker and quicker as the air in our bags got fouler and fouler. It was never possible to make a match strike or burn inside our bags. Of course, we were not iced up all at once. It took several days of this kind of thing before we got into really big difficulties on this score. It was not until I got out of the tent one morning, fully ready to pack the sledge, that I realized the possibilities ahead. We had had our breakfast, struggled into our foot gear, and squared up inside the tent, which was comparatively warm. Once outside, I raised my head to look round and found I could not move it back. My clothing had frozen hard as I stood, perhaps 15 seconds. For 4 hours I had to pull with my head stuck up, and from that time we all took care to bend down into a pulling position before being frozen in. By now we had realized that we must reverse the usual sledging routine and do everything slowly, wearing where possible the fur mitts which fitted over our woolen mitts, and always stopping whatever we were doing directly we felt that any part of us was getting frozen, until the circulation was restored. Henceforward, it was common for one or other of us to leave the other two to continue the camp work while he stamped about in the snow, beat his arms, or nursed some exposed part. But we could not restore the circulation of our feet like this. The only way then was to camp and get some hot water into ourselves before we took our foot gear off. The difficulty was to know whether our feet were frozen or not, for the only thing we knew for certain was that we had lost all feeling in them. Wilson's knowledge as a doctor came in here. Many a time he had to decide from our descriptions of our feet whether to camp or to go on for another hour. A wrong decision meant disaster, for if one of us had been crippled, the whole party would have been placed in great difficulties. Probably we should all have died. We were now getting into that cold bay which lies between the Hut Point Peninsula and Terror Point. It was known from old discovery days that the barrier winds are deflected from this area, pouring out into McMurdo Sound behind us and into the Ross Sea at Cape Crozier in front. In consequence of the lack of high winds, the surface of the snow is never swept and hardened and polished as elsewhere. It was now a mass of the hardest and smallest snow crystals, to pull through which in cold temperatures was like pulling through sand. I have spoken elsewhere of barrier surfaces, and how, when the cold is very great, sledge runners cannot melt the crystal points, but only advance by rolling them over and over upon one another. That was the surface we met on this journey, and in soft snow the effect is accentuated. Our feet were sinking deep at every step. And so, when we tried to start on June the 30th, we found we could not move both sledges together. There was nothing for it but to take one on at a time and come back for the other. This has often been done in daylight, when the only risks run are those of blizzards which may spring up suddenly and obliterate tracks. Now, in darkness, it was more complicated. From 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. there was enough light to see the big holes made by our feet, and we took on one sledge, trudged back in our tracks, and brought on the second. Bowers used to toggle and untoggle our harnesses when we changed sledges. Of course, in this relay work, we covered 3 miles in distance for every 1 mile forward, and even the single sledges were very hard pulling. When we lunched, the temperature was minus 61 degrees. After lunch, the little light had gone, and we carried a naked lighted candle back with us when we went to find our second sledge. It was the weirdest kind of procession, 3 frozen men and a little pool of light. Generally we steered by Jupiter, and I never see him now without recalling his friendship in those days. We were very silent. It was not very easy to talk, but sledging is always a silent business. I remember a long discussion which began just now about cold snaps. Was this the normal condition of the barrier, or was it a cold snap? What constituted a cold snap? The discussion lasted about a week. Do things slowly, always slowly. That was the burden of Wilson's leadership, and every now and then the question, shall we go on? And the answer, yes, I think we are all right as long as our appetites are good, said Bill. Always patient, self-possessed, unruffled, he was the only man on earth, as I believe, who could have led this journey. That day we made 3¼ miles and travelled 10 miles to do it. The temperature was -66 degrees when we camped, and we were already pretty badly iced up. That was the last night I lay, I had written slept, in my big reindeer bag, without the lining of eiderdown, which we each carried. For me, it was a very bad night, a succession of shivering fits, which I was quite unable to stop, and which took possession of my body for many minutes at a time, until I thought my back would break. Such was the strain placed upon it. They talk of chattering teeth, but when your body chatters, you may call yourself cold. I can only compare the strain to that which I have been unfortunate enough to see in a case of lockjaw. One of my big toes was frostbitten, but I do not know for how long. Wilson was fairly comfortable in his smaller bag, and Bowers was snoring loudly. The minimum temperature that night, as taken under the sledge, was -69 degrees, and as taken on the sledge was -75 degrees. That is 107 degrees of frost. So that's where I'm going to stop. There's lots more in that vein, and the cold gets worse and the adventures get more exciting. So if you want to read it, you don't even have to buy the book, because you can find it online in Project Gutenberg. But that's it for me for tonight, so thank you very much, and I'll leave it there.